Hey guys, and welcome back to our brand new Code Vein video. My name is Hollow, and today we're going to be discussing each and every weapon type in the game and my overall opinion of worst to best. Naturally, you might order them differently yourself, and there's absolutely no shame in being wrong, guys, none at all. Let's start by breaking down the core components of the 5 weapon types one by one, going through them in no particular order, and then at the end, I'll give you my worst to best list. Let's jump in first with the Halberd type. So if we just want to jump straight into the meat and bones of it, the Halberd has an really good moveset. We're talking about a 360 spin, or even 180 in worst case scenario, AoE attack associated with most of your attacks, and really good range on that as well. So the core moveset that you have with this weapon is really strong and good for dealing with big groups of enemies and attacking a bunch of enemies at once, which is what you're doing in like 80% of the game, you know, where you got a bunch of enemies running at you. But every now and then you will have, like, let's say some big warrior come at you, some big monster, or you just have a boss fight where you're facing off against one target. It's still a strong weapon there because of its really great speed, really good movement, but the abilities that come with it that you might pull from Lewis's code to have an iframe jump forward double slash, or the Queenslayer code where you have basically an 8-strike combo that's really quick. And if you combine this with the basics of 2 light attacks, which is basically a double hit, then a triple hit of a 360 spin all around you, great AoE ability, right? And then follow that with a quick, light, heavy, you know, not a charged one, but a quick one. And depending on the halberd that you've got, in the case of me, I'm using this garnet one, so it's kind of a AoE slash with a sort of red, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a blood airstrike. It looks cool, does a lot of damage, and it might stagger. Now, I've just done this big combo, right? It's AoE, it's cleaned up the room, and maybe at the end of it, that staggered the big bad enemy or even the boss. Well, then that's when you combine it with the abilities. If you're insane and it's the perfect example, you know, the perfect case, you're able to pull out that Queenslayer 8-strike combo at the end of this big combo you've just done, and you're essentially just hitting the enemy for like 15 seconds straight, doing insane damage and staggering it. But that's a really specific rare case, right? You don't have a high stagger value on a weapon like the Halberd, you know? Like I say, it is kind of a mid-class weapon. It's lighter than a greatsword and a hammer, and heavier than a one-handed sword or the bayonet, but it doesn't have a huge stagger value, and the attacks are quite slow, and they CC you, you know, they take some time to perform. So yeah, great AoE, great combos, but it leaves you really vulnerable pretty much all the time. And if you use these combos or attacks at the wrong time, you're in for a lot of damage coming your way. But because of the nature of this, you know, these insane combos, the high damage, the 360, yes, it CCs you, but a good player, a good halberd user will absolutely clean through packs of enemies. And if you're thinking about maybe farming a bunch of haze to, you know, kill a bunch of enemies, halberd might be actually the ideal weapon of choice if you're good at using it. It's kind of like a jack of all trades, but master of not. Well, okay, it's jack of all trades, master of none, except AoE because it's the master of AoE. You're fast, you're agile, you do a lot of damage, you got big combos, you got that big AoE, you know, every now and then you can hit staggers, and it has really versatile and very strong special abilities. So in this footage, you'll see me pull out some massive combos, do some big damage, but you might also be seeing me get hit, me get staggered, me take big chunks of damage. Out of all the weapon types, I think the halberd is actually the most vulnerable. You might think, well, what about the hammer or the two-handed sword? You know, you hit and then you're very slow. Well, with a big weapon like that, you're able to block. You're able to stagger the enemy and stun it. Meanwhile, with the halberd, you're kind of stuck in your animations for a really long time with that low stagger value without a strong block. So it's definitely a versatile weapon with lots of options and very strong in a good player's hand, a confident halberd user's hands. Lots to say there though. Let's move on to the next weapon of choice, the weapon type. It's the greatsword. This thing has insane damage and stagger values. You're able to smash the opponent with your giant sword, and then it does, you know, ridiculous damage, but because it's such a big weapon, it staggers them a huge amount of time. I'm talking it staggers bosses and big mini bosses as well. If you combine that with the insanely strong abilities that bring out your attacks very quickly, like the triple strike ability, you're able to not only pull out massive, and I mean literally the biggest damage numbers I've seen in the game, long CCing combos, which work really well against every enemy in the game. Not to mention, it's got great range on all the attacks because it's, you know, it's a big sword. It's a great sword. The drawback of the great sword is definitely the builds that come with it. You can either choose a really high damaging build. Let's say you're running Dark Knight with the passive stats that it has. You know, you're going to do loads of damage, and that's actually the build of choice from me when I'm using the greatsword. You do stupid damage, but your Ichor count is actually pretty low in these builds. You know, you're not able to spam out abilities as much as you want. So making use of passives that increase your drain rating, finding windows to do your Blood Veil attacks, to drain Ichor and be able to cast more spells. You should be absolutely playing around your special gift combo abilities with a weapon like this. If you do, well then you've probably got the highest damage build late game. You know, the greatsword, top of the top for damage. I've got a clip here that you might have already seen while I'm talking, where I do a unbelievable burst of damage for about 15,000, comboing up to 30,000 on one boss fight, and the boss can't even fight back. It's ridiculous. Now, I'm obviously saying a bunch of good stuff, right? The weapon also has a bunch of different visuals, you know, a bunch of boss weapons, big great swords, and special ones that you can find around the world. They've got great visuals, you know, they're very cool. It's a big sword. You can do a lot with that design. But it's not a perfect thing. It's not the best build, full stop, by default. It's very heavy. You know, you're holding a giant sword. And so builds that do high damage are going to unfortunately mean you can barely carry anything. The armor that you're going to be wearing is essentially non-existent and the lightest you can find. I actually couldn't run the Dark Knight build that does, you know, the insane damage without putting Alleviate on my greatsword, because without that, I couldn't carry everything. I basically couldn't roll, or I couldn't play because my armor was too heavy, of every armor type that I could find in the game, even the lightest. So I put Alleviate on my greatsword, and what that does is reduce the damage it does ever so slightly to reduce the weight of the sword, and then I could get away with it. Now, if you don't want to do something like that, it's still the most damage when you do that, by the way. If you don't want to do something like that, well then you can run a different type, like the Atlas type that you get from Yakumo, which has a 250 weight cap, which is ridiculous, much more tanky, but does a lot less damage. So you'll be CCing, blocking, and fighting in that kind of style, but you won't be doing anywhere near as much damage. Let's move on to a slightly smaller sword, the one-handed sword. This was actually the first type that I fell in love with, and I would probably say that I played about 60, maybe 70% of my first playthrough with a one-handed sword. Even though I did swap a reasonable amount, I always went back to the sword before I went to the next build. It's super agile and probably the safest you can pick out of all the weapons to play with. You know, when you throw out attacks, you're able to roll out, cancel attacks whenever you want. So whenever you're in a bad situation, you're not really stuck in an animation. Let's say, you know, with the Halberd or the greatsword, you do these big slams, you do these big 360 swings, and during that time, you've got no control of your character. With the one-handed sword, pretty much any of the attacks, even the heavy charge ones, are so quick that you're able to get out of a sticky situation at the drop of a hat. You know, you're safe. And what's great about the one-handed sword is that it's so varied in its builds. You could do a dodge parry build, you could do a caster build, you could do a buff build where you buff up your weapon and hit the enemy so many times that you get the proc of the buff so much that the damage you do is insane, because this has some of the most strike combos out of every weapon type, even more than the Halberd. Combine that with the really flashy combo one-handed sword abilities, you've got something that just looks awesome. You're teleporting around, you're zipping around, you're blasting around every fight, you're in total control of your character because you can jump out anytime since the attacks are so short. If you want to have one of the highest damage early game builds, you want to go one-handed sword, you want to focus on going a quality build and getting a weapon that scales equally with both strength and dex. In this case, you want to go Prometheus, which is what you get from Lewis right at the beginning of the game. It has exactly what we're talking about, equal scaling and strength and dex, and then a weapon that's perfect for it, equal strength and dex scaling, is Lewis's weapon, which you can get at the start of the game, which I made a video about how to do that. And very quickly, you suddenly have an unbelievably strong early game build, all thanks to the one-handed sword. It's easy to use, you got big variety in builds because caster, buff combos, whatever it is you're trying to play. Super flashy visuals because the weapon. I'm a big fan of the one-handed sword in Code Vein. Let's move on to the hammer, which is super comparable to the greatsword because just like the greatsword, it has insane high damage, high stagger values. So you're able to bonk those enemies and do big damage, ridiculous damage, and stagger them so you can just keep bonking them before they can even react because they're just stunned. It's super strong with gifts for attack combos, just like the greatsword. You hit a couple lights, then you throw out a special attack combo. The chain CC staggering continues, letting you do more attacks, and pretty much nothing will survive the ridiculous combos you can pull out really quickly with these. The moveset is definitely a lot less versatile than the greatsword in this comparison. It's basically you bonk enemies by slamming the weapon down on them, you know, use it as a hammer, right? Or do some wide swings. And that's kind of about it. It's not really varied in the movesets. But if you're there for some bonk gameplay, the damage and stagger value is really good. It's a really strong build for gameplay, but it is a bit repetitive and easy and straightforward. In Code Vein, the hammers can actually have a visual of a hammer, right? Yes, obviously. Or an axe. One of the first boss weapons that drops in the game is actually a hammer that's just an axe visually, but functions completely the same as any other hammer. Just like the greatsword, it's definitely easy and straightforward to use, very strong, but personally, I just haven't found as much satisfaction with the visuals of the hammer or the gameplay compared to the greatsword, and, well, they are super comparable. And finally, it's the Bayonet, which you can run as a caster because it scales quite well with those stats, or as the shooter type that actually uses the gun as a primary source of damage. I would actually recommend running a Bayonet as a shooter rather than a caster because it's got unique abilities on the different types of guns. You know, you got your shotgun blast, you got your single shot snipe, or you got your 5-shot spread like the bayonets you get at the start of the game, which penetrate as well for good AoE damage. So it's kind of a waste to just use your bayonet for basic attacks when you could be using that gun. This weapon is absolutely 100% single target orientated. It has a very basic moveset with the light combos, and when you use the heavy attack, well, there isn't really a heavy attack unless you combo it. It just shoots the gun. So depending on the type of gun that you've got, whether it's the shotgun blast or the snipe or the 5-shot spread, will depend on how you use it. The 5-shot spread is pretty much an AoE ability, and the snipe is obviously single target blast for high damage. Given the nature of the bayonet, I found myself enjoying and preferring running the sniper type the most, which is what you're seeing in this gameplay, because you can absolutely blast enemies if you have the ranged impact buff active at the same time. The movement set, like I say, is pretty simple with the bayonet, you know, not much range on it, pretty quick, very light, kind of like the one-handed sword, but not as interesting, not as varied. So that's super repetitive, if I'm honest. And single shot firing your gun, well, of course, that's also repetitive. But it does have a really unique gameplay aspect. You know, no other weapon plays like this thing. Since it's light and fast and pretty much dex orientated, you've got some really super flashy abilities like the special, I'm going to mispronounce this, the Fulisade Rondo, which is the thing you get from Mia that she does, where you do this purple like 4 shots in a row and you're getting all flashy, like whipping your arms around. It's ridiculous. It's so anime. It looks great. It's really fun to use, does high damage. You know, it's a really cool aesthetic, the bayonet, and it's got this vibe that's kind of, it's just satisfying and fun. You won't get this kind of gameplay with any of the other weapons. Okay, so there's some information, a bit of gameplay on each weapon and how I feel about it. Now let's rank them. You might be able to guess what's going to be at the bottom of the list at number 5. For me, it's unfortunately the hammer type. About the most interesting aspect of this weapon in Code Vein is the fact that it can also be an axe. That's about it. It's really high damage, really high stagger value, but so's the greatsword. And the greatsword kind of does it better due to the fact that it's more versatile and you can face different scenarios in different ways because of the different moveset. Whereas with the hammer, you're kind of just bonking the enemy and that's it. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me, it's really too simple, and the visuals were kind of lacking, Code Vein. You can do some awesome things with the giant hammer in terms of aesthetic and design, and they seem to just kind of not really do anything with the hammers in Code Vein for some reason. Just gave it a couple of axes and said, you know, hey, that's good enough. Number 4 for me is a mix-up. It could easily be number 3. They feel kind of interchangeable to me. This one, number 4, is the Halberd. Like I said, it's got such a good moveset, such big combos, such good AoE, but the drawback and why it's number 4 for me is how long it really CCs you. You're just so vulnerable when you're using this thing. If you attack at the wrong time, you're going to be stuck spinning around and you're going to get hit. Not to mention, because it's quite a heavy weapon compared to the one-handed sword or the bayonet, you can't really make use of different armor types. You're kind of stuck to a few select ones, and you're going to take more damage because you're using a lighter type. The Halberd absolutely takes a specific type of player and playstyle, and perhaps that's just not for me. Moving along to number 3, it's the Bayonet, which is, like I say, could have been quite interchangeable with Halberd, but the Bayonet comes up just ahead because of its super unique gameplay style. I've never played a game like this, especially in a Souls-like, where I'm playing with a gun and like playing kind of Ranger. You know, you look at Bloodborne and the guns in that. Yes, there were some small aspects of the gameplay where using the gun for damage, but primarily, no, not all. The flashy abilities, the melee and ranged hybrid gameplay, it just makes for a really cool vibe and aesthetic, something that I just really appreciate. But because it's pretty, you know, one-sided and repetitive, that's why it's my number 3. Number 2 has got to be the one-handed sword, and that could have been number 1, so close. Like I said, this is the weapon that I used most of my playthrough, my first playthrough. So agile, you know, there's so many different ways to play it with a quality build, the balance build, the caster build. Whatever it is you're doing with this weapon, it's always flashy and satisfying and very safe to use. Not to mention, like I said before, this weapon has some of the coolest looking weapons in the game and so many different types and visuals, and you can get them so early as well. You know, you can get some really cool one-handed swords really early in the game. Super versatile with single target attacks or AoE with wide horizontal swings, and it's my primary weapon for a spellcaster for a reason. It's great for drain attacks, it's great for buffing up, and I get to see all those flashy spells when I use this weapon. So it's got to be my number 2, but it just barely lost out to the greatsword, which I picked up towards the end of my playthrough, like the last 20%. My god, the damage of this thing. I found the warped blade towards the end of the playthrough. It's like this jagged greatsword, and I didn't look back, man. As soon as I started using it, the damage, the stagger, the versatile moveset of the weapon with the AoE strikes, the big slams, and then a certain boss's boss weapon that gives it this ridiculous visual as well with the purple blade on the end. Oh god, it's good to be using a greatsword. Sometimes you need to pretend you're Guts from Berserk. And when I'm using a greatsword in Code Vein, I just feel absolutely unstoppable with the big combos. And frankly, the broken damage that you can pull off with this thing. I wonder what the speedrunners are going to use, but I think they might use the greatsword. And best of all, man, this thing is easy to use, so anyone could pick up a greatsword and do work. And there you have it. Now, you might disagree with some of the orderings of this list, so I'd be happy to hear, how would you order these weapons? What's the best in your eyes? Or maybe I even got it bang on. Let me know in the comments. For the end of the video, though, we've got something a bit different, a bit special. The folks behind Code Vein and Bandai Namco were actually kind enough to send Rage a special gift to open, so let's check that out.
Hello there, it's me. Just want to say a quick, massive thank you to Bandai for this ridiculously awesome treasure trove of treasurely treasures. All of the Code Vein goodies, and it's just fantastic. You got the little blood bead, a little bit of info on all the characters, on some lovely cards. You can even grow your own blood tree. Have you ever wanted your own blood tree? Well, now you can. I'm gonna grow the blood tree, so honestly, you shouldn't get excited. Really, I feel bad now. Either way, this is really neat, and I hope you guys have been enjoying the Code Vein content, and it's so much fun! But yeah, thank you to Bandai, and, well, back to you, Hollow.
That's right, it's back to me, so I can say goodbye. So, goodbye. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.